Hi. How are you? Well, I'm sorry, you didn't read the fine print. I cannot begin my program unless there's a certain measure of enthusiasm. Hi, we're in Chicago. How are you? We're all attending the Chicago Humanities Festival. How are you this wonderful day? Yeah, it may rain in the external world, but in the humanities, the sun is always shining. So, you know, it's an interesting thing for me to be here talking to you about not just national parks, the national park idea, or my novel, Gloryland. It's just interesting just to be. And when you work in national parks, people don't snicker when you say that. You can just walk through a meadow, you can walk through a forest, and just sit there and take in everything that's around you that reminds you of where we as a people began and where we have our roots. I was never taught, I was never told when I was a child that I had roots in the national parks. I was never told that these celebrated places belonged to me. I would have looked for a bill of sale. I would have looked through my wallet and says, I own Yosemite. That's interesting. I own the Grand Canyon. I looked, believe me, for such a receipt, and I never found it. So for much of my childhood, those places that have become celebratory of the American wilderness, those places that make me imagine being taken away. That was not part of my childhood. I grew up in inner city Detroit. Is there anyone here that has ever confused inner city Detroit with the national parks? There's a marked difference between the west side of Detroit and Yellowstone or the Grand Canyon. It usually doesn't happen where people show up in Detroit and they say, excuse me, is this Yellowstone? Is this Yosemite? That would be a sign of derangement. But the interesting thing is, if you could go back in time to the 1600s and you were to show up in the exact same place in what is now Detroit, that began as a colony in the New World, a French colony, which was once described as a place where you could see buffalo, a place that was marked by the sound of wolves howling off in the distance, where there were elk, where there were bald eagles and osprey. Yes, we're still talking about Detroit. That is Detroit as it was. And it never was taught to me, never told to me when I was a little boy that where I was walking along the streets of Detroit was once a great wilderness. Chicago was once a great wilderness. Some may argue it still is. I do not. I heard that, careful. I'm a ranger. We always walk on the edge. Yeah, okay. But Chicago was founded. There was a trading post here, Jean-Baptiste Point de Sable. There was an African-American who ran a trading post, and apparently that was the beginning, the early days of Chicago. Even this great city, and it is a great city, was once a wilderness area. And so when I say wilderness, and we hear the word wilderness, it's also reflective of history. Now we hear wilderness and we think something positive. As John Muir put it best, climb the mountains and get their good tidings. Nature's peace will flow into you as sunshine into autumn leaves. Now, in the 19th century, that was seen as the words of someone who obviously was touched with the infinite. It hasn't changed today. Those were radical words 100 years ago. Those are radical words today, but I never heard them growing up in Detroit. Knew nothing about wilderness growing up in Detroit. I was just trying to survive. Is there anyone here who's just trying to survive? How's it going? Yeah, that's all I was doing. And so the fact that I eventually became a park ranger in both Yellowstone and then in Yosemite is is absolutely astonishing to me. And the thing is, it's such a far journey from Detroit to Yosemite. And when I look out and I see you, and I see these folks there, and I see you right there, and I see you, and I see you, I'm thinking of all the different journeys that each of you have taken that have led to this spot right here. And being in the parks has reminded me that there are everyday sort of miracles that happen that are never given credit for being what they are. For example, the likelihood of having this exact same group of people sitting in the exact same seats that you're in right now is probably 1,000,000,000 to 1. Having everyone here in this event, the exact same people, probably won't happen ever again. Wouldn't you say that something that happens once in this universe that will never happen again for the rest of creation is a miracle? So sometimes, I have to wait for the response. This is a miracle. It's a miracle. So we are living in the miraculous right now. I do it as a vocation. I step outside my office, and when I look up, I see and hear and feel the 5th highest waterfalls in the world, the highest waterfalls in North America. I step a little bit more farther away from my office, and I look to the left, and I see Half Dome, one of the largest exposed pieces of granite on the face of the earth. And then I'm so in awe of everything that I'm seeing that sometimes I can neglect the mountain lion walking right there. But no fears, because the mountain lion is also, I'm a mountain lion in Yosemite. How many of you think I'm getting carried away? I don't know. I think that if you're a bear or a mountain lion, and you happen to be a bear or a mountain lion in Yosemite, that's a step up. It's an incredible place. So I see so many things when I'm in that environment, but one thing that I do not see is I do not necessarily, on a daily basis, see myself reflected. From the very earliest forays of going into these environments, which also go into you, I would not see other African Americans. And I was troubled by this. I was bothered by it, because when you're in a place that makes you just go, look at that, that's amazing, look at that, and you turn around and there's all these people around you, but there's no one who looks like you. I saw very few African Americans my first summer working in Yellowstone National Park, and it bothered me, and it still bothers me. Why? Because of the theme of this festival. The theme of this festival is America. And for me, what could be more American than the national parks? This idea that Wallace Stegner spoke about has spread all over the world. Over 150 other countries have national parks. I was lucky enough to be on the delegation, the second National Park Service delegation to China. And we went all across China for 3 weeks, and there were all these parks that had been there. And some of them had been there. Now we have to keep this quiet. Stop the recording. Some of them were older than Yellowstone. There was a park in Fujian province. Notice how my voice is getting quieter. This is how rumors get spread. My voice is quieter because there was this park in southwestern China, in Fujian province, called Wuishan. And Wuishan, I found out, was quite old. And being an ex-Yellowstone ranger at the time, the birth of the national park idea, the fruition of that idea is in Yellowstone National Park. I'm thinking, so how old is your little park? Anyone here in Chicago recognize that bit of swagger? Like when you're out and abroad, you say, I'm from Chicago. It's a great city. It is a great city. So I had that. I'm a Yellowstone and a Yosemite ranger. And I said, so how old is your park? And the interpreter said to me, Wuishan was set aside by the emperor. How many of you noticed a situation where the ground that was stable at one point begins to somehow shift beneath your feet, and what you thought was solid ground is starting to become somewhat liquid and unsteady? And I was thinking, emperor? There hasn't been an emperor of China since Puyi. And I said, so which emperor? He said, he told me the name and I didn't recognize it. I said, when was he emperor? He said, during the Tang Dynasty. And I went like this. This is called this is unease when I do that. I'm going, okay, Tang Dynasty is 8th century AD. And I said, so the emperor set it aside, but was it called a national park? He said, no. I went, oh, see? Wasn't a national park. Yellowstone, March 1st, 1872. He said, no, the emperor set it aside, but it was free for everyone to come into the park and enjoy the beauty. And the ground completely broke open, and I fell, because what he was describing, by any other name, was a national park. The difference was that Wuishan never sparked a movement. Yellowstone, March 1st, 1872, sparked a global movement. Global to me means the rest of the world is involved. Does global to you mean that same thing? Global means the rest of the world is involved. Well, if the rest of the world is involved, then why is it that so few African Americans and Asian Americans and Hispanics have embraced fully our national parks, especially my own particular culture, which is African American? That troubled me, and it bothered me. And when you have something that bothers you, and then you find an environment that gives you the solution, that gives you the key, I call that the intersection of preparation and opportunity. That's called Yosemite. I was found by a story. Is there anyone here that has also been found by a story? A story that spoke to you so clearly that it reached deep inside your gut, woke you up and said, I just learned something about myself that I never knew. That's what great stories can do. And that's why the oldest of all art forms is probably storytelling, sitting around a fire, sharing a story. I was discovered by this history of African American stewardship of Yosemite and Sequoia National Parks. In 1899, 1903, and 1904, those national parks were protected by the Buffalo Soldiers, African American cavalry and infantry regiments called Buffalo Soldiers. Just keep it quiet in here. You know, they're called Buffalo Soldiers because in their interaction with the Plains Indians, the Cheyenne, the Lakota, the Dakota, they saw that the hair on these men's heads was just like the matted cushion between the horns of the buffalo. And they began calling them Buffalo Soldiers. And this history, I realized, was a tool, a means of changing the future. So I invested all myself, spiritually, intellectually, emotionally, into telling the story and getting the story out. Why? Because it was internationally and nationally significant, and it was only known to about this number of people. That's the number of people who knew that Buffalo Soldiers once protected Yosemite National Park 16 years ago. Today, it's known to maybe 80 or 90 million people, primarily because of a very obscure documentary filmmaker who you probably have never heard of, but I'll give you his name. He's really, really good. And he has a partner by the name of Dayton Duncan. He's wonderful too. And this guy, his name is Ken Burns. I know you probably aren't familiar with his work, but he's really good. And he made a film called The National Parks, America's Best Idea. And of course, the Buffalo Soldier story, this history of African American stewardship of the national parks, became part of that film. And then the following year, I had sent a letter to this very, very, very obscure talk show host. You probably have never heard of her. Her name is something like, Oprah. Oprah. And I invited her to Yosemite. Why? Because I felt that a story is a great thing, but every story must have a vehicle to transmit that story. And I felt that if Oprah issued an invitation, African Americans would hear, listen to her, and perhaps come to Yosemite. And Yosemite would be the gateway to the entire national park system. And so I was shocked when she actually read my letter. I was shocked even more when she actually came. Shock is not a strong enough term to describe it, but she did. And there has been an increase in African American visitation in Yosemite subsequent to the Oprah Winfrey Show. It's even affected my own life. I'm not used to walking into my local grocery store and having a couple from South Africa recognize me. Or meeting someone at the visitor center who's from China and they recognize me because they saw the Oprah Winfrey Show. What occurs to me is the people in my own community in Detroit who may have no idea of all the work that I've been doing on behalf of my own community and the community at large. Because any story that disappears that's an American story diminishes all of us. Everyone here is the result of some American story. Everyone here is on a journey. So my work has been to communicate that history, to communicate that story, so everyone feels the sense of connection. Because I'm standing here, I'm holding this flute, and I'm looking at my hands. And I'm thinking, okay, I'm a park ranger, and I'm looking at my hands, and I see that there are veins here, and they're full of blood, and I'm thinking, you know what? That blood is of African descent. That's part of my ancestry, Africa. I remember being in the Peace Corps in West Africa. I was in Liberia, and I talked to many of my students about this, and you know, there was a big cultural difference between me and my students who were Pele, or Kru, or Bassa, or Mandinka. But that's where my DNA is encoded. And then I also look at my hands, and I think what's coursing through my veins, and I recognize that I'm also Indian. I'm of Indian ancestry. My mother is half Cherokee. My maternal grandparents are black Cherokees from Oklahoma. And I'm thinking, what does my personal history have to do with the story of the Buffalo Soldiers that have been so focused on trying to communicate? Well, in the course of my research, I find that at the turn of the last century, a census was done that determined 1 out of every 3 African Americans had an Indian branch to their family tree because they would escape from plantations, and the native peoples would take them in. The Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminole. My father's side of the family, there's Seminole blood, which is in me. My mother's side of the family, there's Cherokee blood, which is in me. And yet, I'm telling a story about the cavalry, and then I see this history that seemed more remote. It gets closer and closer, and I realize that I'm not just telling their story, I'm telling my story. No story is more important than our own story. Is there anyone here that would agree to that? That our own personal histories are the most powerful histories that shape us as a family, shape us as people. And so when I found that this history of Buffalo Soldiers protecting Yosemite and Sequoia National Park in this faraway place from Detroit was actually my own history, I was not thinking that I was going to a national park to find my own history, but that's exactly what happened. When I saw these photographs of these soldiers, I realized that I was seeing relatives of mine, that they could have been relatives of mine in a completely unfamiliar context, because almost all of those soldiers were from the Deep South. Is there anyone here from the Deep South? I love how you did that. You said, should I raise my hand? Should I keep it down? Okay, good. There we go. You're from the Deep South. There are a lot of folks that came here from the Deep South. The Blues came here from the Mississippi Delta. America and American history is filled with people that are on the move. And so when I'm looking at these muster rolls, this listing, giving the names of all the soldiers who served in Yosemite and Sequoia, and when I started, I didn't have a single name. And I was told that there was just a handful of soldiers serving in the parks, and that handful grew to 400 to 500 soldiers. And I had the listing of every single name of every single soldier who served in both Yosemite and Sequoia over a 3-year period. And when I looked to see where they were from, what I found was Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas. They were all from the South because most African Americans lived in the South prior to 1900. And so essentially, when I looked and saw that, I realized these men could have been my father, who was born and raised in Spartanburg, South Carolina. My father, who was told in the 1930s by my grandfather, quote, "Boy, if you don't leave the South, one day I'm going to find you hanging from a tree." My father left the South. He joined the U.S. Army. He served in Berlin right after World War II. He was in the infantry in Korea, and he was in the Air Force in Vietnam. I realized that in the telling of the Buffalo Soldier story, I had stumbled into my own story, that their history was my history. And by celebrating their contributions, I was celebrating my father's contributions. My father never saw my one-person show as a Buffalo Soldier, but now he has the best seat in the house because he passed away. He's right there right now. There is nothing that you can do greater for the past than to tell a story that was forgotten, especially a story that people will find meaning in. Why I tell the history of Buffalo Soldiers is to connect my own culture and all cultures to national parks, because national parks are the fullest, purest, most beautiful expression of democracy that we have. Did you hear clearly what I said? The clearest expression of democracy that we have. And if somebody were to say to me, well, why is that important? Say that to me. Say it with passion. We're talking about parks. Funny you should ask. It's important to me because I recognize, as do many others, that you can't talk about America and the American character without also talking about wilderness. I'm looking through the catalog of all the different things that are happening with the festival, and I keep looking for wilderness, and I don't hear or see anything. I didn't see anything about wilderness, and I'm thinking, we as a people were shaped by these encounters, these visceral encounters with wilderness. The great national epic that would have been worthy of a Homer or a Virgil is Lewis and Clark, The Core of Discovery. That's the great national epic in my mind. And African Americans were part of that because Clark's manservant was York, more than just a manservant who served as an interpreter, who even served sometimes as a guide. He was indispensable. So I'm thinking I'm part of that national epic, that the West is part of my heritage. But when I was growing up and I'm watching television, anyone here watch television? I turn the TV on, I would very rarely ever see a Western where there were people in it who looked like me. So my thought was, we must not have been there. And so for many African Americans, the West is this sort of foreign landscape. We had nothing to do with it. But the opposite is actually true. 1 out of every 3 of the cowboys who made that run, those cattle drives from Texas to Kansas, 1 out of every 3 was Hispanic or of the Caddo or African American. And yet, when you watch John Wayne, Montgomery Clift, Red River, I kept waiting for the vaqueros to show up, and they weren't there. And so when I'm in the national park and I see this history and encounter this history, I realize that I can do something about it. So I'm on this stage primarily because of people who were forgotten, people whose history was not remembered. And if you don't tell a story, this is essentially what will happen. Did I make my point? Silence is the worst thing. So my feeling is this. I need your help. If you know a story about women, people of color, that you think that's an important story, more people, how many folks here have encountered a story that has spoken to you and you've said, more people need to know about that? How many of you have had that kind of an experience? How many of you have felt the responsibility to do something about it? Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, kind of, sort of, okay. But if we all did something about it, if we all do something about it, and those stories are out there, then it becomes part of who we are as Americans. And opinions are based on what we know. So what if what we know is faulty? So if you fill in those blank spaces in the history books with these stories, then the decisions that we make and the opinions that are formed from those decisions will be much better informed. So my goal from the very beginning was to get this story out and to make this idea, what it always has been from the beginning, a democratic idea. I want to see absolutely everyone there because not everyone has received an invitation. Case in point, I'm in Yosemite a few years ago. There's an inner city African American kid who's sitting there looking up at Yosemite Falls. Anyone here been in the position of looking up at Yosemite Falls? He's looking up at it and he's just like this. And he was from, I think, Compton, South Central LA. He's just like that. And one of the hosts walked over to him and said, "Excuse me, are you all right?" He says, "Yeah." She said, "What's wrong?" He said, "I had no idea that such beauty existed." That's what he said. Because if you're in the inner city, you don't hear about Yellowstone. You don't hear about the Grand Canyon, Arches, Zion, Bryce, Canyonlands. And the irony is that all of those places belong to everyone in this room. You are the owner of the Grand Canyon. You are the owner of Canyonlands, Zion, Arches, Bryce, Mount Rainier, North Cascades. Everyone in this room owns some of the most beautiful landscapes in the world. But if we don't know that, if we don't feel that, we won't go out there and claim it. I literally work in a place that can change people's lives. Just opening their eyes and seeing it, you can see this transformative effect they get on them. I've seen it in members of gangs who were there. And they come in and they're like this. They get out of the car, they look up and this happens. I find it much more interesting to look at people looking at Yosemite, especially people who are most surprised that a Yosemite even exists. I grew up in the inner city, and I would argue that the people who are most transformed by the experience of the national parks are the people least prepared to experience them. It comes as a surprise because no one's talked about it. Within my own culture, we talk about the urban experience. We talk about the rural experience. You can read Richard Wright, Native Son. You can read Gene Toomer, Kane. And you hear all about African Americans in rural America, African Americans in urban America, but not African Americans in wilderness, wild America. The Civil Rights Act was passed what year? 64. The Wilderness Act was passed what year? 1964. The Wilderness Act and the Civil Rights Act were passed the same year. Maybe they're really about the same thing. Maybe they're really about freedom. The Civil Rights Movement is about freedom. It's an expression of freedom, but wilderness is an expression of freedom as well. We have a Bill of Rights. We have a Declaration of Independence. How about this? What about a Declaration of Interdependence? How do you feel? Is that a good platform? How about running for office? On a platform of interdependence, that nothing exists by itself but is bound to everything else in the universe. Doesn't ecology naturally flow from that? Well, in the parks, you can see it. In the national parks, you can actually feel it. And park is a misnomer, because when you're in a park, it sounds like, if you're in a city, an urban park. But when you're in a national park, there are mountain ranges around you. I'm from Detroit. None of the parks in Detroit have mountain ranges. But when you're in Yellowstone, there are separate mountain ranges there, and these environments shape you. They change you, and they influence you. And I feel, and honestly and earnestly believe, that who we are as a people is the result of these experiences of wilderness. How many folks here have been here for a long time? Their families. How many folks here have relatives or ancestors that were pioneers? Recent immigrants, faraway immigrants? How many folks know about the pioneers? Okay, you heard about it. You saw a movie with Randolph Scott or something. We hear about the pioneers, but the pioneers were not Americans. They were people becoming Americans. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? When we're a nation of immigrants, right? Some are forced immigrants, some kind of volunteered to be here. But no one arrived as an American. Everyone arrived from the place that they came from and were transformed by the continent itself and then became an American. The country was literally found and explored from the East Coast to the West Coast and also from the West Coast in. And it's that friction with the land that changed us, that made us into Americans. When you are on the Oregon Trail or the Bozeman Trail and you are a mother or a father and your child dies on the journey, and you have to bury your child on a trail, off the trail, and you know you may never see them again. How many of you folks, show me your hands, would say that at that point, that ground becomes sacred? We think a church is sacred. A church is sacred, but where you lay to rest someone that is your blood, that has your spirit, that place has now become sacred. Think about how many places in the United States where there are unmarked graves where our people, and I mean that collectively, our people, our ancestors, the folks who made their way on those trails, not everyone survived the journey. They were laid to rest, and that became America. And that's what shaped us. The deserts, the mountains, the swamps, the cold, all of those things made us Americans. So what would happen if we lost the national parks? If Yosemite Valley became the most exclusive gated community in the United States? There is an entrance station there. You know, I mean, wouldn't you rather hear, "Welcome to Yosemite National Park"? Third oldest national park in the United States. The valley is the most celebrated glacially carved canyon on the face of the earth, and it belongs to you. Welcome. How many folks like that? Okay. How many people are comfortable with this sound? Hello. What business do you have here visiting the Rockefellers? I'm sorry, let me check. I'm sorry, your name is not on the list. How many people dislike that sound? If the national parks had not been created, that's what many of these places would be. Gated communities. They would be exclusive haunts of the very wealthy. So when people talk to me about democracy, I talk to them about national parks. When people from other countries talk to me about what makes Americans tick, what makes an American different from someone from France or Europe or Luxembourg, what makes Americans different? I said, well, the first thing you have to understand about Americans is that we have this entire experience of a frontier. I said, what do you mean by that? For most of our existence as a nation, there's been a frontier. And the frontier was moving east to west and also west to east. As Horace Greeley said in the 19th century, "Go west, young man." Why did he say that? Because he knew that most people were stuck in whatever social, economic climate they were born into. If their dad was a plumber, they were going to be a plumber. If their mom was this, they were going to be that. You couldn't step outside of that. So, but if you went to the west, you could reinvent yourself. How many of you folks find that notion of reinventing yourself in another place to be a very American idea? Anyone here ever stood in the shadow of the Statue of Liberty? Yeah. A very interesting but American idea. And so that, for me, is what makes the national parks so important, because they, in the future, and they weren't set aside for this reason. They were set aside to preserve wilderness. And it's not by coincidence that the first national parks were created around the same time that the wilderness was officially declared, or the frontier was officially declared closed, around 1890. So just when we thought we have everything wrapped up, oh, maybe we should make that into a park. Yellowstone, 1872. Yosemite, 1890. Sequoia, 1890. Mount Rainier, 1899. But nothing before Yellowstone, because up to that point, wilderness was something that to be used, to be transformed into something that was utilitarian for our purposes. But to look at the land as existing in its own right for its own welfare was completely alien at the time. So if we lose the parks, we lose that connection to the very environment that shaped who we are as a people. No Yellowstone, no Yosemite, no Grand Canyon, no Zion, no Arches. Are we still American?
No.
Say that louder.
No.
Passion. Oh, that's all right. You're absolutely right. We're not American. So holding on to these parks basically means holding on to our essential selves. That's what separates us from the rest of the world. We've had this experience as a frontier nation. I mean, I'll just throw names out, and I could just see the looks in your face when I start saying them. Daniel Boone, Davy Crockett. You know, those are stories that we hear. John Fremont. But you don't necessarily hear about James P. Beckworth, Rocky Mountain Fur Company, famous mountain man, but he was African American. So that story wasn't as well remembered. We need all of these stories to remind us of where we came from, but we need more than just stories. We need the locale where it took place, the stage where it took place. Have you folks noticed that I'm standing on a stage? See, here's part of the problem. Right now, as I stand on the stage, I'm being filmed. And a film creates a film creates a layer of distance between myself and the story. The stage creates a layer of distance from myself and the story as well, because the stage that I'm on isn't alive. But when you're in the Grand Canyon, You're looking down into something that's half the age of the planet. We're in Yosemite. The stage is alive. The rock itself was magma that became soil, that became plants. And then the birds and the animals are there reaping that harvest. It's very much alive. And I love the idea that the world itself is a living world. And you can feel that in these places. And you can also experience what our ancestors experienced hundreds of years ago. When I go to Great Smoky Mountains National Park, it is a homecoming because I'm Cherokee. When I go to the Everglades, it is a homecoming because I'm Seminole. These places that are my places belong to everyone here. And if that's not an American invention, if that is not worthy of protection, I don't know what is. But it's not my opinion, it's your opinion. It's our opinion. Are the national parks worthy of being held aloft as a gift to the world? I would say, considering the tens of millions of people who visit the parks, that the answer is decidedly yes. But we need to reach out to everyone and let everyone know that they have a stake in the parks and that the parks belong to them. I'll end with this. A short time ago, a few years ago, I was a stand-in for Ken Burns. There was a conference. It was called, I forgot the name of it, but it was basically a show catering to the tourism industry. And there were 5,000 attendees from 70 different countries. And Ken was on camera, on stage. He was on the film, and he introduced me, and then I introduced his film to the delegates from these 70 different countries. And I remember thinking at the time, and I almost said this, excuse me, is there anyone here from Detroit? Is there anyone here from Compton? Is there anyone here from South Central LA? From Philly? From Chicago? From the South Side? Anyone here? But there were folks there from France, Germany, Africa, Luxembourg. They were all over the place. And there was an introduction and a welcome to the national parks. I never received that. But that message needs to be communicated. And more importantly, it needs to be felt. Because all I'm really concerned about is I don't want Yosemite or Yellowstone or Grand Canyon to disappear. I wrote my novel, Gloryland, so that it could be a touchstone, a cultural touchstone for my own culture to connect with a place that they perceive as being foreign, but really is a homecoming. That's all that parks mean to me. I'm standing here and I'm talking to you. I'm already home. I'm already there in Yosemite Valley. I'm already in that place that has claimed me. That's how I ended up in the film. I'm a bit passionate about this. I'm on medication. The only cure is more national parks. How many national parks can you visit? Never enough. What's my favorite one? The one I just visited and returned from. Where do I want to go now? To the new one, the next one, in some other country. And I wish we could all go together, because wherever we go, no matter where we go around the world, we'll still be experiencing a part of America. It could be the former Soviet Union. It could be China. It could be Japan. It's still, if it's a national park, there's a little bit of the DNA of Yellowstone that's there. Why? Because the legislation that was used to create Yellowstone was modeled after a letter that was written by Israel Ward Raymond years earlier. This man named Raymond wrote a letter to Senator John Kness. John Kness drafted the legislation that would become the Yosemite Grant. That legislation became the legal precedent for the Yellowstone Act, and the Yellowstone Act literally is the model for all national park legislation all over the world. The same language that you read in almost any national park around the planet, you can hear an echo of that going all the way back to this forgotten person by the name of Israel Ward Raymond. How many people here have heard of Israel Ward Raymond? Yeah, just a guy who loved Yosemite. How many people here love a national park? Letters are good. And he wrote a letter to this junior senator from California. And that letter literally changed his thinking. That became part of legislation. And as a result, it influenced Yellowstone. And the Yellowstone Act became known all over the planet. It became the legal precedent. So there's a little bit of California in the national park legislation of every national park all across the planet. Now, if that's not an American idea that is spread around the world, I don't know what is. So how about a hearty, before we do the question and answer, a hearty round of applause for the national park idea, which although it did not begin in the United States. It experienced its infancy here. It experienced a period of enlightenment here, and it literally arose from the soil to become part of our own native soil. There is nothing more democratic, nothing more American than the national parks, and we can applaud our contribution to world culture. Silence is a very powerful thing. I hear it all the time. I showed it to you. But I'm waiting for questions, if you have questions. I think, are people supposed to come up and use the microphone here?
I can bring it to them.
Okay.
We want to, because we're recording the program, it's important to get your questions on the microphone.
Is there any plan to phase out the private residences in our national park system?
I would rather not speak to policy. The reason for that is that I'm not here in my official capacity as a park ranger, and I am just a park ranger. And the Park Service is very much like the military in terms of the hierarchy. And so imagine asking a similar question about the Army, and you're asking that question to a sergeant. How many folks think here that the sergeant would be very, very uncomfortable answering that question as the colonel walks by? Yeah. So I'm not deflecting your question, although obviously I am. I mean, I am, I'll be honest with you. But I can't really speak to policy. I can speak to philosophy, but not policy.
Rocky Mountain National Park, they had a program years ago. I worked out there one summer. They had a program when the family that owned this commercial enterprise passed away, that commercial enterprise was then seeded into the national park system.
Right.
And I'm aware of a recent Tribune article over the past week or two of private residences in national parks.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you're aware of, not setting policy, but if you're aware of any plan to address the issue of eliminating private residences from a national park. That sergeant would know, how to drill and how to load his weapon. I'm just wondering if you know of any plan to get rid of these residences.
Okay. Any ranger would only be familiar with their own particular park. Okay. I work in Yosemite, I've worked in Yellowstone, I've never worked in Rocky Mountain National Park, but they're called in-holdings, what you're referring to. And usually they're grandfathered in. And the point of the Park Service is a superintendent of a national park wants a whole park. They're not usually comfortable with these little islands of private property within their realm, within the boundaries of the park. So the ideal would be for at some point that area to go back to being part of the national park. But every park has its own history. Every park has its own political history. And so in Yosemite, there's a few families that have these in-holdings in an area called Aspen Valley. And they're in those families, and they've been there for over 100 years. Would the park like to have that particular property? Of course it would. But it belongs to them. So if they are amenable to the idea of their land becoming a gift to the nation, which of course reflects a lot of national park history, especially with regard to the Roosevelts, and in particular the Rockefellers, then certainly that could potentially happen. But it's something that has to be worked out that's amenable to both sides, because we can't just jump in and just say, this is a national park, you have your private property here, but it's surrounded by national, so we're going to take it by eminent domain. That's called really making a bad neighbor. So the ideal would be, yes, all those lands would become part of the national park. I'm in Yosemite, Wawona. It's filled with private property. It's private. There's areas all around. There's 2 or 3 different areas in Yosemite that are enclaves of private property. And yes, the superintendent would love it for it just to be Yosemite, but there's this recognition. We would love that. How many people here would love to have certain things that don't exist in the world? I mean, we would love that, but it's not to say that we're working on acquiring it. But if those people are amenable to donating that land to the park, the superintendent would just probably say yes. But it's a hard thing. It cuts to another American thing, the whole idea of property. Private property versus public property. Public domain versus not. The thing that's important to keep in mind is that every national park was once the indigenous homeland of people, and that land was taken from them. I'm Cherokee. I'm Seminole. There are people right now in the Yosemite area that they see the whole area that is now the national park as their ancestral homeland. The Paiute, the Chukchansi, the Okutsk, the Miwok, they all see themselves as this is our land that was taken from us. And then now other people have it, and then they're saying, no, that's now our land. Now that's getting to another history of America. So I hear exactly what you're saying, but I'm also looking at not the bottom, I'm looking at the foundation of that. There's always been a history in the United States to some degree of theft of property. Can I just say that? Can we just be honest? You know, I mean, I descend from indigenous people who were stolen from their land against their will, brought to this land, and the only work that they could find that made them gave them a sense of purpose and connection, for many of them, was serving in the U.S. Army, where they were used to basically remove from the land the indigenous people of another continent. So I'm fully conversant with the whole notion of land that is occupied by people that was taken from them, or land that people want to hold on to. I mean, it's a very sensitive subject. It's a very sensitive subject. You're welcome. Yes.
Two questions. Could you give a kind of a summary of your book and maybe a little more history of the Buffalo Soldiers, just quickly? And then, as a park ranger, how many different areas of talks do you master? You know, how many different subjects does an average ranger, learn about and is able to communicate and and share? Thank you.
I'll answer your last question first, which is all of them, from geology to soils to botany. Plants, wildlife, everything. But also how all those things interrelate to each other, how they're interconnected, which is the whole idea of ecology, which comes from the Greek word oikos, which means home. And so basically, when I give people a walk into Yosemite, I look at Yosemite itself as a house with all these different rooms, and each room has its own ecology, each room is its own habitat, and I try to show how the doorway that attaches one to the other can be walked through from one to the other.
Would you say that's 1 score, 2 score, 3 score? I mean, I don't know, maybe there's a number, maybe there's not a number on that, but I'm always been amazed when you go to these interpretive talks.
Yeah.
The rangers are so knowledgeable about so many things.
Well, I think the key thing is that to not see anything separate unto itself, but you're always looking at interrelationships. And that's what ecology is all about, interrelationships. So when you go in any interpretive program, a ranger program, it's the best way to learn about the natural and cultural history of that place by someone who's already assimilated it, who's already digested it, and actually knows all the clarifying points and can communicate that in a way that's fun. I mean, science is fun. Science is exciting. Science is intoxicating. Excuse me. I mean, really, it is. And that's what rangers do, is they pass on that passion. So, and then the first question again?
First was, could you give a quick summary of your book and, maybe a little more synopsis of the Buffalo Soldiers, a little more, perhaps?
Well, all I'll say about my book is that, again, it's the fictional memoir of a black Indian who became a Buffalo Soldier. He became a Buffalo Soldier primarily because he didn't want to do anything that he felt was subservient. He wanted to do something that made him feel good about himself. And there were very few positions in society that were open to African Americans at that time, other than joining the U.S. Army. The civil rights movement, to some degree, began in the military, because the military figured out early on that, separate and unequal doesn't work. So Truman passed an executive order in 1948 ending segregation in the U.S. military because it just became too complicated, saying, okay, you guys go into this truck, you guys go in this truck, but we're in a hurry. Okay, everybody get in the same truck. I'm not sitting there. Yes, you will. How do you win a war when you're fighting within yourself? What is it? A house divided against itself cannot stand? It's the same thing. So the history of Buffalo Soldiers is essentially the story of African Americans defining for themselves and contributing to the country themselves. And there was this definite feeling of sacrifice. If I give my life for this country, if I shed my blood for this country, will this country make the lives of my children better? That's what many of the Buffalo Soldiers, that's what they actually thought. It's in their writings. So when you think about the Indian Wars, and you think about all the movies that we've seen, with the Cavalry trilogy, Fort Apaches, you think of all those films, you think about the African Americans or the Buffalo Soldiers participated in that story, but think about how complicated it might have been to be a person who has Indian ancestry fighting in the Indian Wars? How about if I say it to you in character? This might make it easier. This is the soldier talking. I'm so happy my grandma's not here. She's Seminole. She used to always go on about how the cavalry killed all her people. She'd sit there in a corner and she'd just close her eyes tight, blocking out the light of the day. I said, Grandma, what you doing? She said, I'm just killing. Who you killing, Grandma? I'm killing all those soldiers that killed my people. I'm killing them dead. Took all that away from me. Killing them dead right now. And she opened her eyes and they were not there and she thought she got rid of them all. What would my grandma say to see me in my cavalry uniform? To see me wearing the uniform of the people who killed her people. But what am I going to do? If I did nothing to improve myself, I'd be a sharecropper. I pray to God every day for a better world. I'd be a sharecropper. And I just look and say, hey, Lord, look down on me. Do something good for your child today. I'd still be a sharecropper. So I joined the army. I become a soldier, get $13 a month, same as a white man. Yeah, I got to fight in the Indian Wars. You're a soldier. You don't get to tell the lieutenant where you're going. You get told what to do. And the duty is rotten, but it's $13 a month. I send some of that money back home. It's a start.
I want to know how you made it from Detroit to Yellowstone, your personal journey.
It's
What
really fast.
awakened you?
Yeah. I was just walking along Detroit and this van pulled up and there were these rangers inside. They opened the door. They just dragged me in there. They put this uniform on me and they drove me all the way to Yellowstone and I was just in time for seasonal training. And that's how it started. No. It started because of my parents. My father served in the military. And when he was in Germany, my whole family went with him. My brother, my mother, and my dad. And my parents took my brother and I to Berchtesgaden, which is a stronghold that Hitler had high in the Bavarian Alps. And so that part didn't register with me. This is Adolf Hitler's stronghold. What registered with me were the Bavarian Alps. So I'm there, and I see and feel the sky around me, and I could look down, and I could see clouds. You know, you can't look down and see clouds in Detroit when you're walking along the streets, but I could look down and just see that there, as my son used to say when my wife and I would take him to the Grand Canyon, that's a big down there. That's what I was feeling. There's a big cosmic down there, down there. And I'm holding on to my mother and my father's hands, and I'm looking up, and the clouds are above me, and they're beneath me, and heaven was right there. God was right there. That's how close I was to heaven. And I realized you didn't have to die to get to paradise. All you needed was a good pair of hiking boots or a horse. And you could just walk to paradise, and you don't have to die. How many people are all in favor of reaching the next world without having to die? I was in favor of that. And so I never forgot that moment. How many people here have a moment from their childhood that they've never forgotten, and it's changed you and influenced you? I never forgot that feeling of holding on to my mother's hand and my father's hand in Berchtesgaden in the Bavarian mountains in 1963. I never forgot that moment. And so when my family moved back to Detroit, I had these memories of the Bavarian Alps. There are not very many inner city kids from Detroit who have memories of the Bavarian Alps. And I was sharing one of these memories, and my mother said to my dad, he's remembering Germany. He's remembering that trip to Berchtesgaden. So every time from that day forward, I saw something on television about the mountains. I felt resonance. I felt some kinship. I felt a connection with that place, wherever it was. Wherever I go in the world, whenever I'm in the mountains, I feel at peace, and I feel at home, and I feel that my father, who passed away 5 years ago, there's no distance of 5 years between me and him. He's right there in the air around me. If I had not been on that trip, maybe I'd be in an assembly line, like my grandfather, working for Ford Motor Company. But I majored in poetry at the University of Michigan, so I probably would be a tenured faculty. Sitting at my desk saying to myself, oh, I could have been a ranger. How did I let that slip away? Did I answer that question? Yes. Yeah.
You, I think, very movingly talked about the impact of visitors to Yosemite in particular, And I'm wondering whether there's particular evidence of climate change going on there, and is there any way in which what is going on there can impact both visitors and those of us who encounter you and encounter those who have been there, that we can get some understanding of what's really going on
Well,
and
actually,
what we can do about it.
yeah. What's really going on can be found in the national parks. National parks are great places to learn about climate change. There are programs that rangers present specific to climate change effects on the ecology of that particular park, especially if you're in a mountain area or mountainous area like Yosemite or Yellowstone. You know, what we're experiencing is amphibians. Amphibians are going up and up in elevation because the habitat that they're used to, that they've evolved in, those conditions are actually shifting uphill. As I usually put it when I give my programs, you can only go up so much until you run out of mountain. You know, and so if the mountain is gone because you've gone out of this area in elevation and you keep going up and the mountain's not there anymore, that's called not extinction, but extirpation, which is extinction within your own particular environment. And so you can actually see this and you can hear about it and you can see it actually afoot, so to speak, in the national parks, because national parks are great natural laboratories to see it actually working. It's not something in a classroom setting. It's something that is vibrant and it's alive and it's right there in front of you. So I think they're the best places to learn about global warming. Go to Great Smoky Mountains. Go to Voyagers. You know, talk to the rangers there and say, how is global warming affecting your park? And then may say, well, at this point, we haven't received that much or effect from it because there hasn't been that much of a change in our climate. But one of the changes, for example, in the Sierra Nevada, they're already saying that global warming will affect the Sierra and that more of our precipitation, which falls mainly as snow during the winter months, more of that precipitation is going to fall as rain and less as snow. And the snowpack of the Sierra Nevada drives the agriculture of the Central Valley. And the Central Valley is the breadbasket for the United States to some degree. I mean, think about all the food that's produced in the Central Valley. So obviously, if there's less water there, that's going to affect all the agriculture that's growing there. And the agriculture that's there affects the park because of the chemicals and fertilizers and things that they use in the park. It gets blown inland up into the mountains. So the air quality in Sequoia National Park has been affected by the industry that's going on in the Central Valley. So all of those things are connected. There's a problem with the whole idea of national parks. Keep this between ourselves. But one of the problems is parks aren't islands. They can be described ecologically as islands, like Darwin's finches and the Galapagos Islands, but they're not islands. And so whatever happens in the boundaries, beyond the boundaries of the park, eventually will come up into the park itself. So that's part of the problem. But as far as learning about global warming, I can't think of better places to actually study it. Not just mountains, but also going north in latitude as well, like in Alaska. Glaciers. Glaciers. I'm 54 years old. How many glaciers will disappear before I pass on? You know, one of my childhood dreams was to see the glaciers in Kilimanjaro. Are they still there? Every time I hear someone who was a friend of mine who's come back and says, go soon. You know, I mean, it's just amazing. Think of Glacier Bay. When you look at historic photographs of Glacier Bay 100 years ago, it's just all white. And you look at it today, it's just retreated back and higher. So the change is happening, but it's happening incrementally slow. But that doesn't mean it's not happening. Just because we can't see it with our own eyes, just looking at it doesn't mean that something is happening before our own eyes. It's just happening in geologic time, which is very slow, except when you have the intersection of real time and geologic time, which is known as a lahar, or a volcanic eruption, or an earthquake, or a tsunami. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Amy? Yeah. Thank you. How about if I play music to depart the theater from?